welcome everybody back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today we have Nina Power. I think it's probably worth saying to Nina, because you are not on Twitter, but maybe you were at one point.
Yes, I have an account which I follow people on, but I don't post anything because it was driving me mental.
Okay, good. So to sort of explain for Nina and maybe new listeners, Doomer Optimism is this sort of meme that emerged on Twitter among people who are sort of exploring, I don't know, just like positive ways to live despite all the doom. And so mostly we've been focusing on things like environmental issues or agriculture, but I've just been in these circles with really brilliant women and men thinking about issues of like relationships and culture and like how are we supposed to be as humans in family and all of these like sort of more intimate parts of our lives. And so then I started going down this Ivan Illich rabbit hole. I found you on YouTube, which like your analysis of Illich has made it really accessible to me. And then I was like, okay, I just need to talk to Nina if there's like no other option really as a first step here, if I can get her, and I'm so glad you came. So first, I'll just let you briefly introduce yourself and your background, and then I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the conversation.
Oh yeah, okay, sure. Well, thank you for the invitation, and there's some nice words from you. Yeah, so I guess I'm a writer. I was an academic for about 13 years. I taught philosophy. I still teach philosophy at adult education level, and also in this kind of brave new post-academic, para-academic world, which many of us are sort of living in now. And yeah, I sort of found myself, I suppose, maybe this relates to the Illich thing, becoming more and more deinstitutionalized and sort of unable to operate in institutions. And I think this is true of almost everybody I spend time with now. And it's not a criticism of people who have to work in institutions, but I think, at least for me, there were so many things about it that I was unable to kind of deal with, both like physically and mentally. And I had a kind of like breakdown, stroke breakthrough, as R.D. Lang might put it, like a real proper midlife crisis, which is very interesting. And I sort of decided I couldn't go on in this way. I was also kind of suffering from other things, like a sort of alcohol issue, and just everything was wrong. And so yeah, I guess I'm a writer. So I had this book out recently called What Do Men Want with Penguin, which is maybe to go with your Doomer Optimism thing, which is I think probably a Doomer Optimism book.
Yeah, totally. Totally, I read it, yes.
Right, if I understand the concept right. So like I think the book is quite optimistic, actually. I think it's trying to diagnose the situation we're in vis-a-vis how, well, in the first place, how men are being portrayed, which I think for me has shifted in a very negative direction, which has nothing to do with this kind of old left, which I feel like I was a part of, which was much more like sympathetic and compassionate, and to something kind of much more antagonistic and divisive. And I'm very influenced by people like Ivan Illich you mentioned, but also kind of people who I think are being more and more cut out of contemporary academia in many ways. So people like R.D. Lang mentioned, or Bataille, or some of these kind of more liminal figures. And yeah, I suppose just trying to think about where we are in a sort of more realistic and reasonable way, like through the madness, and try to think about alternative ways of being together. So for Illich, this would include like ideas of conviviality. I'm very interested in like the dialogue as a philosophical mode, like a very ancient mode of speaking and being with somebody, and I think all of these things have been kind of eroded in the academy as it exists, which is just incredibly corporate, like this debt making machine. Like it feels unethical to work really institutions. And I was very involved in like the free education movement, like the student movement, now over 10 years ago in the UK. And obviously we kind of lost that battle, which had a kind of very negative knock-on effect, I would say, on the left. And so, yeah, so I'm kind of interested in thinking about these like alternatives, but in a real sense, like not in this kind of utopian way in which it's basically impossible to get there, but more like, what can we do now? Like whether we're in the midst of collapse or not, it's like, what can we do now?
Yeah, right, exactly. So that's totally the project here. And it's like, it's basically, I think, increasingly post-left, because it's just sort of like the left sort of just leans, well, I think there's probably a utopian project on both sides, but the left sort of leans into this utopian politics. Like either it's perfect, it's this perfect thing that we've determined in advance, or you can't do it, or it's rot or something like that. So I think part of what I'm trying to do is like get into the nuance and messiness of real life on this. So okay, so the structure I had in mind for this is inspired by Mary Harrington, somebody I consider a growing, from acquaintance to friend of mine. And I was in a chat with her, and we were talking about what is a female Chad? And we were like, and the women in the chat were sort of like struggling with this, like, what is a female Chad? Because the male Chad, it's like pretty clear, it's like this big strong guy, tough guy, whatever, you know, extremely masculine. And then we're like, well, Mary comes back with this insight. There's not one female Chad, there's three. It's the maiden, the matriarch, and the maiden, the mother, and the matriarch. And women have these distinct phases in life. And I think then we got into this discussion about how probably consumerist society wants to make all women into the maiden Chad, against their own wishes. And so then the whole goal of being a woman in society is to be this maiden Chad forever. Anyway, so the reason that I bring that up is I think what keeps coming up in the Doomer Optimism community, and like, you know, people trying to figure things out right now, is like, what is our vision for women, or relationships, or the relationship between men and women through the life course? And I think the life course would be a good model for this conversation. And maybe we can we can go through thinking about maybe starting in adolescence, and then going through maybe like the dating world, and marriage and family, and maybe you know, matriarchhood and older age, because I think for me what's really, really useful is to give people concrete examples of the ways to be, you know, like what is a vision we could put forth for adolescence that doesn't have these pathological reactions to, you know, being a woman or being a man. And you know, I think the other thing I wanted to just like highlight before we get started on that project of this conversation is people are sort of interested in the Doomer optimism world, and other people I see, they're like trying to grasp at what are traditional ways of doing things. Let's learn from those traditions and maybe pull from them. And we do have the benefit of like having done all this history and all this anthropology and like knowing so much about traditional cultures, but without necessarily pulling every single thing like from the trad world. You know, maybe there are some things to leave behind. So to keep in mind, like, you know, maybe as we're talking, to say, you know, here's a model that's traditional that I like, that appeals to me, but maybe we don't want this part of that traditional culture to bring into the modern world. You know, like there is a way, I think, to navigate these things in a modern context, you know, keeping those things in mind. So anyways, let's start with adolescence. And I guess like, let's just start talking about, you know, what is an appropriate, you know, way to start thinking about adolescence in our modern world, differently than the way things seem to be going right now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, no, that all makes sense to me. It's like, I think one of the major things, and I talk about this in the book, I mean, particularly in relation to men, but let's talk about women as well. Like is this kind of de-ritualization of society. Like, you know, we don't have these kind of markers that you would have with like a traditional society or religious society. So like things like adolescence are not really marked in any particular way, and they're often, I think, increasingly experienced as a kind of horror, as if you're the only person in the world who's ever gone through this. Whereas I think a culture that was more wise would, in the first place, I think, as even quite recently, you know, I'm older, like I'm in my 40s, like in the 90s when I was a teenager, it was like life was definitely hard. Like you understood that life was difficult, that adolescence would be kind of potentially unpleasant, but it was unpleasant for everybody. And something about that kind of rational, wise understanding actually helped you personally deal with it.
Yeah.
Whereas I think now this kind of individuating quality of this culture means that I think particularly girls, but boys in a different way too, like experience like the trauma of adolescence as something like a need to escape from it, right? So I think obviously we you know, in the 90s, girls you know, had eating disorders, right? There was self-harm. Now I think we have the kind of transgenderism as this kind of you know, this almost this desire to like escape your body, you know, the idea that it's so horrible to have this body because of the implications in terms of sexuality and so on, that like, oh, if you don't identify with this particular image of womanhood, then you must not be a woman somehow. You know, so I think like everyone needs to chill out and like accept that adolescence is kind of a terrible time for everybody, but there's a way in which, like in a community way or a family way, that people can be supported through it, and part of that might almost be to celebrate it in a way, you know, to mark the occasion. Okay, this might be like a bit embarrassing or something like that, right? So if you're a teenager, you don't want anything like that maybe, but to not kind of, as you say, pathologize something which is actually a very normal, well, of course it's a normal process, right? Like it's something that everybody goes through, you know, it's like a marker of adulthood. And I think it has to be understood in a positive way. Otherwise, people are just going to, you know, become incredibly unhappy and upset and potentially make decisions about their bodies which are kind of irreversible or very dangerous.
Right. And I think if I might riff with you, two things come to mind. When I studied abroad in Italy, I saw groups of boys and girls who are, you know, adolescents, young teenagers, just together in a big group, hanging out together. And I really liked that model. The Italians told me it's like group dating at that age. And like, you know, people, the sexes are learning to like navigate each other together in one big group, and there was some cohesion there. I think that was really good. Another thing I can think of as a model, I went to this Catholic school in Chicago growing up, and we had retreats. It was an all-girls Catholic school, and we had retreats every year, culminating in the senior year retreat, which was called Kairos. And it was like, it was you know, we went away, it was secretive, you didn't know what was going to happen. And when you got there, there were like student leaders chosen by previous students, and the student leaders would sort of tell some issue, you know, some story from their perspective of like what's difficult about being an adolescent, basically. And then we would all just talk in smaller groups about it, and then get back together and sort of debrief in the larger group. And that was a profound experience for me in thinking like, I'm not alone, you know, this is normal. Everybody else is struggling with this, as like a peer-to-peer network. And it was transformative for everybody, every student, and everybody sort of knew Kairos was this amazing moment. Oh, and you also got, you didn't know this, but you got letters from all your family and friends, you know, as you're ready to like grow into being an adult, like, we're so proud of you, who you've become as a person, you know, we're all 17-year-olds like reading this, crying. And those kind of rituals I think are possible to recreate in the modern world.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, that sounds like a really thoughtful thing to do. And I mean, I think, you know, in the UK, we definitely didn't have anything like that at a state school. And
right. I
mean, it's interesting you bring up the kind of mixed sexes group, because it's like, at the moment, I'm really going back and forth on like single sex schools, because it's like, you know, like my education was mixed education, and, you know, I've a lot of male friends when I was younger and now as well. but in some ways there's a kind of crisis, I think, that's happening, which is to do with the maybe like the over mixing of the sexes, which is something I try and talk about a bit in the book, but it's also something that Illich talks about as well in the gender book, which is in a way like the kind of lack of separation of spheres creates almost like a single sex that everybody is. Like we've become more like brother and sister. And I think there's a kind of part of the crisis that's happening maybe among younger people at the moment is partly to do with sexuality, and in the sense that it's difficult to handle becoming like a sexual being, having sexual feelings. And I was just reading my diaries from when I was 13, and I kept them all, and they're just like a nightmare. It's like teenagers are like in this terrible state of being, and they're so distracted from schoolwork. And schools in the UK are having a kind of a big crisis at the moment around things like sexual harassment. And certainly there is a way you could describe some of the interaction between boys and girls at school in that way. We never did at the time, but I wonder in retrospect whether there was something not quite okay in some ways. Like it's certainly now in a more kind of anxious age, I think certain normal teenage behaviors are now perceived to be sort of not okay, if you see what I mean. And I wonder whether we might be heading towards a kind of re-separation of the sexes at the level of education, and what that might mean. So I don't know, this is just something that's been on my mind.
Yeah, no,
lately, I don't.
Yeah, no, I don't know either, but I could just speak from my experience, like going to this all girls high school. I found it lovely. I mean, it was like we wore uniforms, which maybe some people would say is horrible, but everybody basically agreed like this was so nice to not think about what you had to wear every day, to not put makeup on, to not be so distracted in your studies, and I think also I probably became like a sort of more outspoken female because I was among peers who are all female, and I didn't have to fear like maybe embarrassing myself in front of a crush or something like that in high school, like in the context of learning. I can imagine, because of the anxious age we're in, and like the at least in the US too, the very litigious society, that like separating the sexes could just lead to a new like a sort of renaissance of like, I think we'll get into this throughout the life course, but a renaissance of recognizing the difference and like the complementarity of difference.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it's difficult for me to say as well, because like my friends when I was a teenager were boys. Like I enjoy things that the boys did, or at least a certain kind of nerdy boy,
right?
So it's difficult for me to say like, oh, it would have been better had I gone to an all girls school or something, but
you could
do
still hang out with people outside of school. I mean, that's how it went with the girls' school. I mean, during school we're with all girls, and then there were dances and social activities, and of course we mixed at that time, and so it was just like a sort of separation where like the socializing time is maybe mixed, and then the education time isn't. I mean, I see strong arguments for something like that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think again it's this kind of like I talk about this heterosocial world in the book, the fact that we're basically compelled to mix all the time, in work, in school, in in everyday life. And there are positive aspects to this, and it's not, it shouldn't be seen in a sexual way, right? Like it's not everything is heterosexual, but but everything is mixed. In our everyday interactions, like sex is there as part of our, as sex as in biological sex, as part of our encounter with the world, and sometimes I suppose it's like, Illich talks about the sad loss of gender, and he uses gender in this slightly strange way, but almost like the separate spheres, like there's no longer separate spheres in modernity. Basically men and women more or less do the same kinds of things, or increasingly, particularly in kind of highly industrialized economies, or post-industrial economies, we would say, I suppose. And there's something of the like you said, the complementarity of difference, or the frisson of difference, or the sort of beauty of difference that is maybe like lost in that kind of proximity, when men and women are together like all the time
and expected to act exactly the same and have the same rules. And then I think it comes out in something like dress codes in
Yeah.
school, where it's like the boys don't have a certain length of short that they can wear, but the girls do. And they're like, well, obviously there is some difference here. And then people say something like, oh, that's sexist or whatever. But, you know, like it's just recognizing that there is difference. And yeah, I think that, and it's also very complicated. I wonder if you have a thought on sex education at all.
Oh gosh. Yes, yeah,
I don't know where I stand on this, honestly, because I've read about it. It's difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think we live obviously in a highly sexualized culture. I think, you know, there's all kinds of like really disturbing things going on in terms of, you know, the sort of prevalence of adult sexuality, right, increasingly into children's purview. And I'm definitely not in favor of like a liberalization of I don't know how to put it, like the exposure to sexual imagery, for example. I mean, I'm increasingly against pornography. I think apart from the material damage it does to people involved, I think what it does is also destroys the imagination, and I think it creates a feeling of shame. And some of the interesting research I did in the book was around like the no fap movement, where young men in particular are kind of, you know, realize that they have a problem with the addictive quality of pornography and widespread availability, and they seek to band together to kind of support each other in stopping using it. And yeah, and it's so interesting and revealing, I think, how many people on the sort of liberal left are so pro pornography, like they, as if it's just some sort of automatically good thing and should be celebrated, you know, and it's natural and normal. And I actually don't think it is. I think it's destructive, as I say, of the capacity to imagine and to fantasize, which are actually part of what it means to be human. And I think if you're just filling your head with images that don't belong to you, you're actually destroying that part of yourself, which also is involved in bonding with other people, right? You know, so that, you know, so I think it's very destructive in ways that I think the liberal position doesn't really understand. It just sees it as kind of free expression and whatever, or you know, oh, desire is good because it's desire and desire is good, or something, you know, some sort of tautologist stupidity. But not all desire is good. And I think, you know, talking about older forms of wisdom, I think people used to have a different understanding of liberty, which was liberty is not the freedom to do anything you like, but it's actually the freedom not to be bound by your desires, which is to say to be in control of them, so that you're not at the mercy of your every whim or your desire to eat too much or whatever, or to have sex, or, you know, like you're actually in control of your, like that's what freedom is. It's freedom from being controlled, including by yourself, if you see what I mean. Whereas I think the sort of post-60s liberal model is no, desire is just good, and anything you feel like doing you should do up until the point of the law, basically, which is terrible. So I think, yeah, so I don't know, I mean, on the sex education thing, I mean, I suppose I'm increasingly, well, I'm in favor of reality, right? I think you know, children should be sort of taught about their bodies in a way that is neutral and positive, which is so that to hopefully avoid people feeling, you know, pathologically internal and individuated and weird, insofar as it's possible to stop that, you know, to feel normal, to feel healthy, to be encouraged to be healthy. I think probably if I was starting a society from scratch, I'd sort of make everyone do yoga, like from the moment they could. It's something that's like I only started doing about 4 years ago, but enormously changed my life, right? So I'm a kind of evangelist for that. I think that would be really cool. Like kids should learn Latin, they should do yoga, you know, like this kind of like super, I mean, Chad in a way, like like all of the best bits of all the traditions from all over the world.
I love
like,
that. Yeah,
that would be really cool. But yeah, I like, what's the rush? I don't think there should be a rush into you know, exposing children towards sexual imagery or sexual thoughts at all. Like I think it's, you know, that already happens like too much and too soon, and I think we do have to like be careful. Like there are people out there who like want to do terrible things. And I think one of the things that's sort of being eroded in some of these discussions is stuff around intuition, like the idea, you know, like women do have a sense when like a man, for example, is like behaving in a way that's a little bit like creepy or a bit worrying, And I think asking women to override those sorts of feelings is like very negative part of our culture.
Totally.
And I think we have to like trust in our feeling if we think that somebody is not okay or they're in a bad state or whatever.
Yep. Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, my own approach, I have 3 girls, and my own approach so far, I mean, my oldest is only 8, so I haven't gotten into the thick of it yet, but my approach has been to be extremely forthcoming when questions arise about the mechanics of it all, and then to be extremely limiting on any sort of like cultural over-sexualization images. So it's like liberal in one sphere and very conservative in the other. It's been okay so far. We'll see how it goes once they get into the real serious years. Okay, so let's move on to the dating world. The dating ages. I think there's so much pathology happening here. I think the main overarching one that it seems like everybody's experiencing is the like consumerization of dating, which is just horrible. And I think everybody's turning against it. And I wonder, I know there's different experiments out there. I wonder if we could reimagine or envision, I don't know if you know Joe Norman at all, but he's like, you shouldn't imagine, he's against this word. He's like, it's too utopian. You can't imagine things in advance or whatever. But I think like just riffing on what potential possibilities for dating could look like that aren't this.
Oh, sure. Well, I think I would defend the imagination as something possible in the present, right? Like I don't think imagination is utopian. I'm precisely like almost taking it away from the overly sexualized imagistic culture. But I don't know. I mean, in my book, I have this defense of risk and openness, which is to say, like people used to meet each other more randomly, right? Like people used to meet each other at work. Now men especially are quite rightly worried about being hauled up on some HR charge if you dare to like look at somebody for more than 2 seconds, whatever. I mean, so that's all become like very paranoid and locked down. And then it looks like the only way you can do it is through the computer, and therefore everything's mediated. But this is horrible. Like it's like you're not opening yourself up to random encounters with people that you might disagree with, for one thing, but you might actually be attracted to in other ways, because like you're screening people in a way, like from their views and everything, like so yeah. And I agree with you that I talk to people about these sorts of things, they're increasingly in the position that you're describing, like they just the commodification, the self, having to put yourself out there in this kind of meat market way. Like people are really feeling that sick of this and revolted, and that I think it's very eroding people's souls, to have to operate in this way. And so I think, in terms of positive alternatives, I think basically like someone asked me, I mean, I don't know anything about dating, by the way, but like it's one of these manosphere men like interviewed me about the book, and he asked me this sort of question about dating, but he's much more in the kind of like pickup artist sort of almost arena, and I was like, go to church, like this is how he was like, how do people meet you? I was like, go to church. I don't know.
I mean, thinking of traditional ways of doing things.
But I do honestly think like if you go out there and do like an evening class or like some local community activity like local gardening, church, parish stuff, that also you're far more likely to meet someone who's also outside of themselves, like someone who's more interesting, more engaged, that's not so like caught up in the idea that they must have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, which is what the dating app presupposes, obviously. So I don't know, it's that kind of openness, but also like maybe more like localism as well, like
totally
wherever you are, like there are people around you who are like really interesting and you just haven't met them yet. And
and I think the only thinking, well, at least when I was dating, which was in the 2000s, early 2000s, the only idea that you could meet somebody only in a bar or something like that, as opposed to like a more wholesome, and I'm thinking back to these Italian teens, like this more wholesome, like I'm just hanging out with these people and they're adjacent to my friend group and there are other activities I'm involved in, and the randomness and the chance. Like I think in general we need to revolt against this standardization of every aspect of our lives by bucking it and taking risks and being and saying like, you know, screw that. Like, I'm not going to be forced to commodify myself. Like, I hate this. And instead, I'm just going to go out, be in the world. That also makes you feel like it builds up your social skills. I think the other thing is like, these people are, you know, I think just stuck behind a screen. And then when you get to the date, it's already so predetermined what the relationship is supposed to be, and either it is or it isn't, as opposed to like this confusing middle ground, which is like fun and like risky and unclear, you know?
Yeah, hang on, I'm really sorry, someone's just ringing the doorbell. Do you mind if we just
No,
pause?
go for it. No, go
sorry,
for it.
Sorry.
We can cut this out.
Sorry about that.
No worries. I mean, this is the important thing about this podcast is I just treat it like fun and low stakes.
Yeah.
It's like, it's fine. It's not a real job for me. It's just fun. So it's fine.
Oh no. But yeah, no, the sort of dating thing. Yeah, totally. It's all about like doing things you wouldn't normally do and getting away from this commodification. And I totally agree when you said about this, the word homogeneity, you know, like that's the worst thing. It's like everyone becoming the same, everyone thinking the same thing. You know, this is a terrible world. This is like a world of conformism and, you know, the elimination of like character and personality. And it's like, if we love somebody, we love them because they're strange or because they're unique in some way. You know, it's like we love their character, you know, and if everyone's basically the same, then there's, you know, it's harder to like find that sort of kernel of them, you know.
Totally. And I think yeah, and I think the other thing is like, I think a lot of people in general feel like they like have no choice with regard to these different institutions. Like they do the dating apps and then complain about them. And I think part of like, at least what I'm trying to get out there is like, okay, I know agency is extremely limited in some capacities, but there is still agency. Like you still could choose to date another way. Like just because other people do it, like, yeah, maybe you have access to the entire meat market on this app, but maybe, you know, the person who's not using the app is like another interesting person who's probably more interesting because they refuse to go down that path and to be institutionalized or whatever. So yeah. I think like, without being too bootstraps about it, like just engage with your agency. Okay, so another sub question I have that I think can run through the ages, but I really wanted to hear you speak about is the topic of male and female friendship. And I think that there's this weird pathological response to male-female friendship, like, oh, you can't have a friend without like wanting to or be attracted to them, you know, like, or eventually it turning to sex or something like that. But I do think that there are models in the past of relationships across the sexes. And I think like thinking about the dating world and maybe even through like marriage and older life, like you can have friends outside of your gender. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you know, in the first place, there are obviously lots of women who have gay male friends. You know, this is kind of a classic model. I think it can be tricky. Like, I'm not going to lie. I do think that if you're a straight woman or a bi woman or whatever, and with a straight man, you spend a lot of time together, you know, the question of sex will kind of announce itself at some point. Of course, it doesn't mean that it's like a will happen or whatever. And I sometimes think some of the best friendships between men and women are between people who at some point had a sexual encounter, but it wasn't going to be, if you see what I mean. So like, yep. they've got it out the way. So that it's no longer an issue, and you can but yeah, I mean, it is tricky. I mean, but I don't like the argument that that it's not possible, right? I think it is possible. I think it depends on your particular situation in some ways, though. Like, I think, for example, you know, I'm not married and I don't have children, right? It's a deliberate kind of choice, and I wouldn't sort of generalize that for everyone. Like, I think, you know, I want to live in a world in which people feel really encouraged to have children. And I think, especially in places like the UK at the moment, a lot of younger people are feeling really like it's really difficult to have children, you know, for economic reasons. They don't have somewhere solid to live, they don't have enough money, you know. Lots of boomers are increasingly not willing to support their grandchildren and so on. I'm hearing these stories, which is really shocking to me. My parents are not like that with my brother has 2 children, they are very, very supportive. But I'm hearing these stories like which are really alarming, like they're kind of pushing this liberal individualism so that even the family ties, like this duty towards your grandchildren, is being kind of like denied, or
Yep.
you know, it's like, you know, people saying, oh, it was your choice to have children, you know, we don't have
so you're on your own now. Yeah.
I think so. I think it's different depending on kind of who you are. I think if you are married, there might be good reasons for having rules around like who you see and you know, in some way. But I think it's got to be an open matter of honest discussion, right? Like what the boundaries are. You know, and I think it's really important to have like both parents, if possible, you know, mutually involved in bringing up children, you know. And I don't think it's kind of negative or normative to say, like, it might be normative to say that, I suppose, but it's like saying these are the values that we would like to inculcate, and we should celebrate them and respect parents where they've made that decision. And I think our society and our culture doesn't really respect fathers and mothers very much, like as these positions, you know, like they're not celebrated enough, you know. And I say that as someone who's not maternal, you know. And but I think women like me should be rare. I don't think I'm I'm not the model. I shouldn't be the model for that. Do you see what I mean? Like, so I wouldn't generalize. I wouldn't want to, in a Kantian way, like universalize from my behavior, because I don't think I'm correct, if you see what I mean. I think there is
a model for your person too, you know, like the aunt or the matchmaker, or you know, there's you know, there is some that plays a useful role in society.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that, you know, an organized society does allow room for that. Like, you know, in a more religious society, you have monasteries or nunneries, or you have, you know, like, I don't know, like women who are more like high priestesses or witches, not necessarily in a bad way, or whatever, you know, or like there should be, or for women who are particularly scholarly, or, you know, like the or men too, you know, like, or hermit like, or whatever, like a healthy society like permits a range of behaviors, some of which are not chosen, right? After all, like not everybody can have children, you know. And I think one of the things that I love Illich for is this recognition of the centrality of tragedy in human life. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think we have a society that thinks, oh, well, if somebody wants something, they should have it. But it's not the case, right? What we should have is a society that permits the expression of sad feelings and recognizes those where people cannot get what they want, which is most people some of the time. And for some people, life, you know what I mean, like, and sometimes life is very tragic, like, you know, if you want children but you can't have them, or for whatever reason, you know. I think we need more kind of culture and more recognition of these sorts of situations, so that it's not always like just demand. It's not just like, oh, I can't have a baby, therefore like I must have a surrogate or something, you know,
right?
Like
or I can't have everything. I think in the consumer society, you're told like you can have anything you want, right? And there's no price to it. I mean, there's just a cost, a cost, financial cost, but there's no there's no, no cost to that. I mean, like, think about the immense cost of, like, for example, I know some women who think it's deeply unfair that they have to carry a child. They think that's unfair, so then they just have a surrogate. But it's like, well, I mean, you're just outsourcing the cost to somebody else's body. If you think it's unfair, how do you justify doing it to another woman, you know?
Yeah, of course. And like, also the child, you know, the child has a relation to the maternal body, and like, you know, you're severing these, you're making these things like, you know, I think are setting up people for all kinds of trauma later on, you know, or it's like incredibly unfair to presuppose that your desire is more important than someone else's life,
right?
I mean, it's like horrific. So I think we need to, I don't know, have a more of a kind of generosity, I think, for a recognition of you know, potentially tragic positions,
right? Or like, I mean, or recognize that in the life course there are difficulties, there are things you can't have, and that's part of like being a human, and accepting and having grace, and having you know, taking on any responsibility comes with some things that limit you. You know, I remember having a conversation with a friend who was horrified that I was nursing my baby and could only stay at X number of hours until I had to either pump or go back to her. I mean, my body's connected to her. I mean, I needed to nurse. I mean, this is what my body's for. This is what, it's sort of, so, but I mean, how horrible that you have this limiting factor to your hangout lunch. It's like, no, it's not really horrible. It's fine. It's worth it.
But
So,
it's the thing.
Sorry,
this kind of fantasy of infinity or the unlimited, and our bodies are not like that. Whatever you choose to do with them, you're limited. It's like, first of all, we're finite, and I think we also live in societies that sort of don't really confront death. I think a lot of the coronavirus stuff was like a panic about the reality of death. It's like all the societies went completely pathological,
right?
Because they're unable to sort of deal with this like natural fact somehow. Like we've become so institutionalized and so hygienic that we can't really like handle death somehow. Like there's something psychoanalytic going on. Like
I know the thing that I keep coming across, I think, when every time I talk about something positive, I just and I see this on Twitter too, because the whole Doomer Optimist crew is about like thriving despite, right? And so people were posting things like, this friend of mine, William Wheelwright, is posting, if every American had a garden, we wouldn't have to have industrial agriculture anymore. And everyone's dunking left and right, like, how dare he think that we should have gardens and have chickens? Like, what servitude and what backbreaking labor and all this stuff. And I really honestly think the underlying issue is that there's like this celebration of the death drive. I mean, it's like there's no other explanation for it that I can come up with. It's like this cultural celebration of, the antinatalist death drive. Like there's no reason to exist. I don't know how to get out of bed every morning, like doom scrolling, stuff. Wait, okay, so we're getting to Doomer. Let's go back optimism. Okay, so for the
but I think they're linked. I think the acceptance of death is optimistic. Actually, I think there is a form of it's a rational and spiritual position to have, which is actually profoundly optimistic. If you see what I mean, like I think to accept that one is limited and one is mortal is actually extremely like positive, because it means that I don't know, for a lot of the ancients, it's like learning how to die and learning how to live are the same things in certain ways. Like if you accept, I suppose, I don't know how to put it. It's like if you feel